marriage, family, child rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. We're going to spend some time in the first hour looking at some of the items in the news. Of course, yesterday we talked about the proposal by Donald Trump, and now it turns out that as people have looked at some of the reactions, they've also found out that, well, lo and behold, this has been done before. Actually, there are precedents in the law and even in the Constitution. So we'll get into some of those conversations, as well as looking at some of the objections and whether or not they're reasonable answers to that. Yesterday, we also spent some time talking about, and we'll get into this in a little more detail, about why we aren't letting Christian refugees into this country. And, of course, this debate about terrorism has rekindled a discussion about guns, and yet it is interesting to see that some of those individuals that actually supported gun control have now been willing to admit that they really had a complete misunderstanding about weapons. And we'll also look at the fact that in many jurisdictions, some of those gun laws are actually not even being obeyed, because this is maybe a bridge too far for some individuals. So we'll have lots to talk about today. And as always, we'll give you a chance to join our conversation. But I wanted to lead with the front page article in USA Today. A killer couple were radicalized years ago. And this comes from FBI Director James Comey, who, by the way, has been under fire, we can now determine, from the White House, because he's been quite willing sometimes to tell the truth about all of this. And in one particular incident that has been reported in the press, President Barack Obama, standing over him when he was sitting at the table, said, "Whose side are you on?" And so I appreciate James Comey, who's our FBI director, and he told a Senate panel yesterday that the killers in last week's massacre in California were individually radicalized before they ever met online and discussed jihad more than 2 years before this deadly assault, which we talked about last week, that left 14 dead and 21 wounded. His testimony actually provides a timeline for Saeed Farouk and his wife Tashfeen Malik, and actually shows that they were discussing jihad and martyrdom before she was granted a so-called fiancé visa back in 2014 and allowed to enter the United States. He says that the early communication indicate that the shooters were at least in part inspired by the Islamic State terror group known as ISIL or ISIS, depending on your particular nomenclature. And because of the earliest discussions of jihad in 2013 appeared to come before the Islamic State's emergence as a global threat. Comey said that investigators were reviewing other sources of similar radical thought that may have inspired the couple. He said that there was no reason to believe that cells of operatives linked to the Islamic State were embedded in the United States planning to strike, largely based on the arsenal of the ammunition and bomb components found in the search of the couple's Redlands, California home. Comey said that authorities were trying to determine whether they had identified other possible targets, and I think the answer to that is probably yes. So, first of all, Saeed Farouk and Tashfeen Malik were radicalized, and for a moment, let me pause. I'm not going to change words all the time. One of the frustrations I have even doing this program is sometimes you have to use phrases that we don't always agree with. Even in fact, in the second hour, we're going to talk about gay. Well, I don't like the idea that it's homosexual, but, sometimes you just have to use the phrase because that's what's used. This word radicalized, probably not a great word. It's going to be one that everybody's using right now, and so we will have to use it because that's how it's described. But think about this for a minute. Imagine if you became a Christian. You walked an aisle, you were baptized, and then somebody later said he became Christianized. You go, what? Christian. Well, no. I mean, I became a Christian. I committed my life to Jesus Christ. I accepted Jesus Christ, however phrase you would want to use. This is, I think, a little dangerous because, we're radicalized, almost makes it sound like they were victims. These were not victims. They chose this. They read this in the Quran. They read the statements of the Islamic State. They embraced this idea of radicalism. And so in some respects, I do a little bit want to set that aside. And of course, as we open up the phones, we'll give you a chance to comment on that as well. But certainly one of those issues is that this is not a group that had, initial reactions. This was not Saeed Farouk, who goes to Saudi Arabia, then meets Tashfeen Malik from Pakistan, and then she converts him. They had those ideas long before that, and so that's certainly an issue that needs to be put on the table. But if you would like to also join our conversation on Donald Trump, I may come back to that because there have been a number of things that have surfaced just in the last couple of days that I think illustrate that those that were saying this is unconstitutional, this is a very sad chapter in American history, oftentimes pulling from some things which were a sad chapter in American history, like the Japanese internment, fail to look a little closer to some things that were actually done. And if you go back to 1952, at that time you have a Democratic president, Harry Truman, and you have a Democratic Congress, and yet nevertheless they passed a law which was called the Inadmissible Aliens Act. And so it was passed by a Democratic-controlled Congress, House and Senate, signed by a Democratic president. And it specifically says, quote, the suspension of entry or imposition of restrictions by president whenever the president finds that the entry of any aliens or any class of aliens into the United States would be detrimental to the interest of the United States, the president may, by proclamation, and for such period as he may deem necessary, suspend the entry of all aliens or any class of aliens as immigrants or non-immigrants, or impose on the entry of aliens any restriction he may deem appropriate, unquote. Now, you have to understand the context here because we basically had shut down legal immigration in the United States from the 1920s to really about the mid-1960s until, of course, Ted Kennedy changed some of that, and we'll get into that later if you'd like. So really what it was attempting to do was address this issue of illegal immigration. You might say, well, yeah, that's pretty far stretch. You're going all the way back to 1952 where you're talking about Harry Truman. Well, we don't have to go back that far because you can go back to the 1970s and find that President Jimmy Carter did the same kind of thing. This piece that appeared in Front Page Magazine, again, talks about Jimmy Carter issued orders to put pressure on Iran, and one of those was to actually ban Iranians from entering the United States unless they opposed the Shiite Islamic regime or had a medical emergency. Those were the two disclaimers in that particular one. I'm reading now from actually what Jimmy Carter said in a speech where he said, fourth, the Secretary of Treasury, State, and the Attorney General will invalidate all visas issued to Iranian citizens for future entry into the United States effective today. We will not reissue visas, nor will we issue new visas except for compelling and proven humanitarian reasons or where the national interest of our own country requires. This directive will be interpreted very strictly. And so he ordered originally about 50,000 students to report to the immigration office, and eventually about 15,000 of those Iranians were actually forced to leave the United States in 1979. So no matter what you happen to think about what Donald Trump has been talking about this week, I think it is at least important to point out that previous presidents have had the authority to do such a thing, and at least one president in really essentially modern times, Jimmy Carter, actually did so. And so we can talk about whether this makes any sense, and we will do so, but at the same time, those issues about it being unconstitutional, probably not. If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We'll have more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
You know, recently on my radio program, I told the story of Charles Napier to illustrate a principle about ethics. Now, many of my guests had never heard the story, and it bears repeating since it has an application to a recent news story. General Charles Napier was the British commander in colonial India. He is perhaps best known for his response to Hindu priests. Turns out that they came to him complaining about the British prohibition against sati. This is the custom of burning a widow alive on the funeral pyre of her husband. Some threw themselves on the burning wood willingly. Many were forced to do so. William Napier was the brother of Charles Napier and recorded his response to these Hindu priests. He said, quote, "This burning of widows is your custom. Prepare your funeral pyre. But my nation also has a custom. When men burn women alive, we hang them and confiscate all their property. My carpenters shall therefore erect giblets on which to hang all concerned when the widow is consumed. Let us all act according to national customs," unquote. You know, Charles Napier didn't play around. He merely said that if you throw a widow on a funeral pyre, we will hang you. Don't tell me your culture permits this. It is wrong. I thought about this the other day when reading about our country's willingness to prosecute a member of Special Forces because he stopped an Afghan commander from sexually abusing a boy who was chained to his bed as a sex slave. Actually, he did more than stop him. He beat the daylights out of him. You know, the U.S. military apparently ordered soldiers to turn a blind eye to this aspect of Afghan culture. Let's be clear. Child sexual abuse is not culture. What the military needs these days is another Charles Napier who's willing to end this Afghan custom. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kirby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
If you'd like to join our conversation today, 1-800-351-1212. Talking about a couple of different issues. We know a little bit more about the radicalization that took place in the lives of Saeed Farouk and Tashfeen Malik, who actually were the ones that last week were responsible for 14 deaths and 21 wounded in San Bernardino. And if you'd like to join our conversation on that, or a reaction to the proposal by Donald Trump, which I'm going to get into in a little bit more detail in just a minute, feel free to give us a call, 1-800-351-1212. Let's head out to Arizona first. Albert, thank you for calling today.
Thank you, Kirby, and God bless you. You know what? I say huzzah for you and your viewpoint, and huzzah for Mr. Carter and protecting our country. But I do have a question, though. Isn't our government allowed to invade our privacy, look at our Facebook, look at everything that we're doing, social media and all that stuff, phone calls and all that, to see what we're up to? And they said they're doing it to catch terrorists. But now they have all this information on this couple that they were radicalized years ago before she even attained her visa. So I want to know, who do we blame for the deaths of those people over there that was unnecessary, when it seemed to me like they could have put a stop to it? Please correct me if I'm wrong.
No, I think you're right. I mean, on the one hand, let's just, because I try to keep a balance here, and it's hard because on the one hand, we've certainly talked about the incredible invasion of our privacy, and John Whitehead's been on this program on a regular basis, and certainly collecting all sorts of metadata on us. And, you know, I'm open book, and you're free to collect anything you want on us. But again, we've been concerned about what that could be used for in the future. So on the one hand, and we're a little bit concerned about that. But on the other, lots of times we go along, we say, okay, this is what we need for security reasons, and we have to go through all sorts of kabuki dances. So when we go through TSA at the airport, and we have to answer all sorts of questions and all of that, and then we find out that theoretically you could have had access to some of this and did not. So I'd like to know, was it a breakdown in data collection, or was it a mindset that says, oh, we better not target a particular couple that's become radical, because after all, that'd be considered Islamophobic? Or did they just drop off the radar screen while indeed, and let's give credit where credit is due, James Comey, FBI director, says they have investigated about 1,000 different individuals in the United States that have connection to ISIS. And were they just not one of those 1,000? Those are questions that I think deserve an answer. And I'm hoping at least some of these hearings, this one yesterday was before a Senate panel, but I hope the House of Representatives and others ask some very good questions. And you're asking one that I wish I had an answer for right now.
Well, thank you, Kirby. I sure appreciate that. And you know what? I hate to say it, but it seems to me like sabotage, like we're being sold out. And may God correct me if I'm wrong. I hope we're not. But I feel sold out. I really do, by my own government. I don't like it. But God bless you. Thank you for your show.
Albert, thank you for calling in. Thank you for listening, and call in anytime. And I will get another call in just a minute. But let me take something real quickly on some of the reaction that's happened over the last couple of days to Donald Trump's proposal. Now, my proposal is, look, I don't think it makes any sense whatsoever to say we're not going to let any Muslims in, but it does make a great deal of sense to say, can we ask some appropriate questions, and can we go through a level of vetting so that we actually can be safer than we are right now, because of the fact that we almost have an open door. And if you wonder about this, let me just give you the numbers for just a minute. This is what's so incredible. We are talking about probably 1.5 million Muslims that have been allowed into this country since 9/11. Now, I don't believe that even a large fraction of those 1.5 million have radical ideas, but I do know that some do. I know others that are born here, as was Saeed Farouk, also have those radical ideas. So you pick your percentage. But out of 1.5 million that have come in since 9/11, if you say it's 1%, that's one number. If you say it's 10%, that's a different number. Recognize 10% would be 150,000. Okay, you say, well, that's just too high. Well, then 1%, wouldn't that be what, 15,000? He said, no, that's got to be, maybe it's like 1/10 of 1%. Okay, well, that's 1,500. See what I'm saying? This many individuals for that long period of time, whatever percentage number you want to use of those that you think are radical, that's what you're dealing with. And of course, the FBI is doing its best, and Homeland Security is doing its best to try to see if it can monitor those individuals who have or definitely have connections to the Islamic State. But these are some of the reactions to that. And let me take on those reactions for just a minute, because some have been saying over the last couple of days that what Donald Trump is arguing for, or even what I'm arguing for, which is not to ban all, but let's see if we could have some kind of filtering system that makes some sense. Some have said, well, that's unconstitutional. Well, I think I answered that just a minute ago. You have the Inadmissible Aliens Act of 1952, which is still in practice and was used by Jimmy Carter to actually prevent individuals from coming into this country. I mentioned in passing that since 1924 to 1965, we had no legal immigration because there was a desire for individuals to assimilate in this country. Some people have said, well, we shouldn't screen all Muslims just to catch a few radical Muslims. And my example that I used yesterday, you might remember, was, down here in Texas, Bluebell ice cream, they found listeria in some of those. So what did they do? Say, well, we'll just try to test for those and be careful. No, they actually pulled all of them off of the shelf and even closed down the plants until they could be sure that the ice cream going into the stores was actually safe. And then finally, of course, this argument that, well, we should never ask a religious test. Well, we do right now on some cases. When an individual is seeking asylum, let's say that individual seeking asylum because of religious persecution, what's the first question we ask? Well, what religion are you? Coptic, Yazidi, Catholic? What are you? And so those are some important questions that certainly are being asked. And what we're seeing right now is a lot of people are not engaging the discussion, which is a worthwhile discussion. Okay, if you disagree with closing down our borders, not allowing any Muslims in, what is your solution? Is it open borders? Everybody comes in? Or do you believe that there are certain questions that could be asked? And of course, we can see that as we look at some of the Republican nominees who are looking to try to become the nominee, I guess is a better way to say that. They've been very critical of Donald Trump. Marco Rubio said that his moratorium on Muslim immigration is offensive and outlandish. Chris Christie said the plan was ridiculous, went on to say this is the kind of thing that people say when they have no experience and don't know what they're talking about. Even Ted Cruz, who tends to not be that critical of Donald Trump, said that instead he would focus on radical Islamic terrorism. So my question to the other potential Republican nominees is, if you don't like Donald Trump's solution, what is your solution? And of course, this is why the debate next Tuesday will, I think, be very interesting, and perhaps one that is now gone from being maybe a potential sleeper into one that everybody's going to watch because they're going to want to see what people say about Donald Trump. But apart from all the name calling and all the rest, my question is simply this. What is your solution? Because we have in the past said that it has been the underreaction from President Obama that maybe has led to the overreaction from Donald Trump. And if you don't agree with either of those two extremes, what's your solution? What kind of questions can we ask? And to get away from some of the false arguments, like it's unconstitutional, or that's not the people that we are, or it's outlandish, or it's ridiculous, I'd look to see what kind of questions you believe should be asked. So those are questions I'm putting on the table to see if you'd like to join the conversation. 1-800-351-1212. And just as we go to a break, let me mention that we're getting closer to year end. And this is a time in which I really want to encourage those of you that have been listening to this program for some time to consider what you might do to support this ministry. We've pointed out before that we have about 1% of the listening audience, actually less than 1%, that actually give. And I've said before that if we could just go from 1% to 2%, we'd probably never talk about finances again. And we've certainly encouraged you this fall to join with us in the Truth Team 360. For as little as $1 a day, $30 a month, you can support us. But if you want to even give a one-time gift, let me encourage you to do so, because what we have as a vision here is to really change this nation. And we're convinced that you change the nation by changing individuals. Change individual lives, and you ultimately change the nation. And certainly over these more than 40 years, Point of View has really been dedicated to doing that. And so I really hope that you would consider what you might do to give to this ministry. And finally, let me just encourage some of you out there that tend to be procrastinators. We'd love to hear from you right now. Almost every time we've done a match fund, almost every time we've done year-end giving, most of the gifts come in the last 24 hours. And frankly, you know, we've been through a kind of a long summer and even a long fall, and sometimes people tend not to give in November and then wait to give in December. But you know, we have bills due right now, so if you can help us out, we would greatly appreciate it. You can go to the website pointofview.net and make your gift. Of course, you can write to us at Post Office Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll take your phone calls. 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
This time of year, it seems everyone's looking for a better, more affordable healthcare solution. But with costs rising and options limited, where do you turn? If you're a Christian, you turn to Medishare. It's not insurance. It's over 154,000 believers who share each other's medical bills. It's about half the cost of healthcare insurance programs. And it's fully acceptable under the law. Best of all, Medishare is based on the timeless principles found in God's Word. You never pay for things that go against your beliefs. Medishare is healthcare that fits your family and your faith.
Learn how thousands of Christians can help you save on your healthcare. For your free information guide, call 844-45-BIBLE. Not available in Montana. Medishare, affordable biblical healthcare. Call 844-45-BIBLE. That's 844-45-BIBLE.
A big thank you to members of Truth Team 360. You make this program possible. Not a member yet? Join today at pointofview.net. Click on Donate Now and become a monthly partner. Pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Talked a little bit about how we're learning more about this couple that actually led to 14 deaths and 21 wounded in San Bernardino. And so again, Syed Farouk and Tashfeen Malik are the individuals that I think illustrate why there have been some that have called for, including Donald Trump, a closing of our borders to all Muslims. Others have said, well, at least we have to have better screening of some sort. And so even as we talk about those who are coming here, the other question, which I address in the upcoming issue of Outlook magazine, is what about those who are already here? Because after all, when you talk about Syed Farouk, he was already here. He was not on a no-fly list. He was able to obtain the weapons legally, actually through a straw purchase, but nevertheless. And so you can see that all the regulations, and we'll talk about that in just a minute, all the gun regulations that are being proposed right now would not have stopped that. So there are lots on the table, but I want to get your comments as well. So we'll head out to Georgia. Antoine, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Yes, how you doing, Kirby?
Good. What would you like to add to the conversation?
Well, I just like to add that I think the United States, as a people, we need to do a better job. A better job in screening, like you said. I mean, especially the ones that's already over here. I mean, who knows? They could have ties to different organizations back overseas and stuff. So it's not just the ones that's coming over here, but if we're going to screen, we got to screen the ones that's already over here as well.
And I'd love to have moderate Muslims that come in here that really appreciate America, are patriotic, do not believe in Sharia law, want to contribute to this country. And frankly, they could be our first line of defense, as I mentioned yesterday, because let's face it, Antoine, you and I, we're not going to Friday mosques, but other Muslims might, and they might say, wait a minute, I'm getting a little bit concerned about this guy Farouk over here, all the things he's been saying and all the things he's been doing. So, we need to depend upon Muslims who do not accept this radicalization to maybe even help us find those who intend us harm. So we need a better set of background checks than we have right now. And if we can't even have those questions being asked, which seems to be the reaction right now to Donald Trump's proposal, then I think the default position becomes Donald Trump's proposal. Because if you can't ask religious questions because, that'd be a religious test, or if you think that asking those questions is unconstitutional, or you have a problem with screening out all Muslims because some might be radical, then guess what you end up with? Either open borders, one extreme, or, shutting down the borders. And those are the only, and I think there's an option between those two, but we'll see. So, Antoine, I appreciate you calling. Let's give a few more of you a chance to join our conversation. We'll head out to Alabama and WBLP. Gloria, thank you for joining us today.
Oh, thank you. I just want to say that I do agree 100% with Donald Trump. He did not say to close them forever. He just said for a while, and who knows how long that might be. But right now, they're not doing a good job. Even if they ask all the right questions, they're not going to, the ones who mean us harm, they're not going to answer those questions truthfully. So I
understand that. And our argument is at least once they are down on paper having been dishonest, that gives us a justification for finding them and deporting them. But your point's well taken. Is one of the reasons why some people say, you can ask all the questions you want, you can vet all you want, but the bottom line is we're still going to miss some. And the bottom line is probably will. Yes, every government program is going to be a failure at one point or another. You cannot get 100% perfection, especially when you're dealing with the government.
And that's true with this Malik. She was so-called screened, but she wasn't checked out totally. So I think, and I agree with Donald Trump, and it's not about religion. It's about a group of people who intend, not all of them, but they intend us harm. That is the basis. That's their religion. That's what they believe. We're infidels, and their religion says, kill the infidel.
Well, Gloria, appreciate your phone call today. I want to give a few more of you a chance to join the conversation today. You can agree or disagree. And if you want to talk about Donald Trump or you want to talk about some of the things we've learned from the San Bernardino killers, those are some topics on the table. A little bit later, I might get into a few others, and that is the issue of the gun debate that's kind of surfaced on a parallel track with that. So we'll get to that in just a minute. But let's take another phone call, and we'll go to South Carolina this time on the Good News Network. Carmen, thank you for joining us today.
Hello, how you doing?
Very good.
Oh, I was just calling to say, I don't think it's a bad thing that what Donald Trump's asking, because already, the taking our prayers out of school and everything already. They're talking about freedom of speech and freedom of religion. That's not even true. The lady put in, prison for standing up for her rights. But my point back to the Muslims, not being prejudiced at all. My mother and father taught me how to love all people of all kinds, and I still do to this day. But I think our main concern should be watching over our country, and at least until we can figure out their backgrounds, especially before they even bring them in. Because to me, we're all unsafe now, and I think that he is actually the only one on the right track concerning our safety. I don't think it makes America mean or racist or biased at all. I just think it's a smart move because they do want to kill us, and it's obvious. Like Obama said, it's contained, and it's not. And it's happening all the time. And I think Trump is on the right track. So, I don't think it's a bad thing. America has let many, many people in. And I just think, for now, they should put a stop to it.
Appreciate your call. Let's see if we can give a few more of you a chance to join the conversation today. Let's head out to Kentucky, WYGE. John, I think have served in the Army. So what are your perspectives on this?
Yes, thank you, Kirby, for taking my call. I've been listening to you for the past couple months. I appreciate everything that you guys have been saying. I do have strong concerns with everything that is going on. I recently retired from the military. The first time that I had come into contact with ISIS was in 2008, and we ran into them in the Diyala province in Iraq. So this is a group that's not, new to the scene. They've been around at least for, several years. So, this is something that has been ongoing. And for us to actually bring in Syrian refugees, Iraqi refugees, this is a slap in the face to those of us who have served. And I can't understand how the current administration could allow something like this to continue. So with Donald Trump's proposals, I understand that a lot of people probably do view this as harsh, but there has to be a check and a balance, or else, the guys that I've served with, they've died in vain because we're just giving them everything that we have fought to preserve.
I'm sorry that we gave them back all that land. If you've looked at some of the maps that we've posted on our website of the land that has been claimed by ISIS, and you think about the battles in Mosul and Fallujah and other places like that, that's another slap in the face. But back to your key point, which is one I've not heard anybody articulate, but I appreciate you doing so, bringing in refugees from Syria and Iraq when we do not know their background, and we know for a fact that some of them are going to pretend to be refugees when they actually want to establish some kind of ISIS sleeper cell in America, doesn't make a great deal of sense. And I think, as you pointed out, it's a slap in the face of those that serve. So, first of all, thank you for your service, and thank you for your comment today.
It was my great pleasure. If I could just interject one more thing shortly.
Sure.
Yes, and the unit that I was with, I was with 1st Brigade, 25th ID. The unit had previously gone into Mosul. We've also, we had taken ground in the south side of Baghdad. We'd also, been what they call the breadbasket as it pushed over to the Iranian border. And everywhere you see this group of people that were fundamentally involved with ISIS, and now we're taking refugees from that very spot. I think that Mr. Trump is definitely on the right page. May not be the favorite of the American society, but for those of us who have served, this seems like the most logical choice for me. I appreciate your time. Thank you for everything you're saying and doing.
Well, John, thank you for calling. Call again, and thank you again for your service. Just before we take a break, let's head up to New Hampshire, WSEW. Vinny, thank you for calling today.
Yeah, thank you, Kirby, for taking my call. First, I'd like to acknowledge the previous caller's comments. Kudos. They were right on. I also wanted to thank you for your comments yesterday. I felt like that was brilliant. That was the first time I'd heard that. I think it's a great idea for potential refugees from Syria to demonstrate their safety with regard to American security. If they can't show that their background does not pose a threat to the American people, then we should not feel compelled to let them into our country.
Who's the burden of proof? I need to take a break, and I'll keep you on hold because I want to get some of your comments. But for those of you who didn't hear yesterday, I just said we've always had kind of the reverse burden of proof. We need to prove as a country why we shouldn't let people in. I said, no, I think we need to turn it around. Individuals that want to come to this country and enjoy the privileges of American residence and citizenship, I think they bear the burden of proof to show why we should bring them in as Americans. It's a different perspective, but I think it's the right one. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. We're going to change topics in the second hour, but of course, if you didn't have a chance to make your comment today, we certainly will have a Friday weekend edition where there will be 2 hours where we can really focus on a lot of very important issues. Vinny couldn't stay with us, I guess, but again, we talked about this idea of a burden of proof, and you sometimes in conversations need to ask who bears the burden of proof, and I think it really is, and I'm hoping this one was taken with the spirit in which it's intended. The burden of proof is upon a person that wants to come to this country and become part of America. We do require that of people that come here legally. We ask them all sorts of questions. We go through background checks, and then if they want to be a citizen, they actually take citizenship classes and even pledge their allegiance to the United States. we recognize that this is a privilege to be an American. And so I think we should have the same kind of mindset when we talk about some of these refugees. If you go to our website right now, I've posted some articles. We may not get to all of them today, but maybe some of them we'll cover tomorrow. I've talked about the fact that there has been a problem in that Christian refugees are not being let in. And so I have posted an article I mentioned yesterday by Abraham Miller, No Room in America for Christian Refugees, which explains a little bit more about that. Also, there is one on the strategy that many people think Donald Trump is using. That's from the article by Frank Gregorski, so you can read that one. And then one other one that I've posted by Kevin Williamson, and it deals with the issue of the fact that already individuals who are seeing these gun control laws coming down aren't always obeying them. He points out, for example, in Connecticut, the state passed a law demanding the registration of certain firearms. Yet a lot of people haven't done so. In the city of Sunnyvale, they demanded that residents hand over all firearms capable of accepting magazines holding more than 10 rounds. Well, that would be every semi-automatic weapon, I would think. Effectively pulling everything from, except maybe revolvers and single-shot rifles. And so far, 0 people have turned those firearms in. So you're starting to see a little bit of backlash to some of the attempts at gun control, and we'll see how that plays out in the next few days and weeks. But let's go to Arkansas this time, KMTC, and Connie. Thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you for taking my call. As I'm listening, I'm hearing comments much like what I would have stated, basically being, I think, just common sense, since our country is in peril, and I say that with all seriousness. We have never been, in my lifetime anyway, I don't know when we've ever been as fearful about people because of the fact that they look like Americans. You know, we don't know who the enemy is when they're among us. So we need to prevent them from coming in. Any person, whether they're Muslim or not, if they want to come into the country, if they cannot be verified as to who they are, where they come from, what their reason is for coming into the country, then we don't let them in. And that would be true for anyone, but especially right now when we are in this era that we live in where we are fearful.
And we can create safe zones over there. Matter of fact, one of my commentaries, which you'll hear next week, talks about how that can be done. And this comes not from me, but from the former deputy director of the CIA. So there are people that are saying, okay, we want to protect some of these people from the civil war that is taking place, but there are ways to do that without bringing them all to this country. Does that make sense?
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much for giving us a place to vent and to share our opinions, and I always appreciate listening to this station or to this program.
Well, I appreciate your call, and I hope you'll call again. Let's real quickly try to get in one more phone call here in Kentucky, KYGE. Donna, I think you want to speak about Donald Trump. You have the floor.
Thank you, and thank you for taking my call. I just want to say that I think that the news media just runs with sound bites and they bash, whoever that they want. But I totally agree with Mr. Trump. I feel like that, even though the current administration probably will not do this right now, I think we'll probably have to have another administration to do it. But for the time being, and he didn't say a length, I think we need to stop everyone from coming in because our system is broken and no one is able. It's going to be a different administration probably that will be able to fix it. And I agree with what you said a while ago. I'm interested to hear you talk about that, how that we can protect the people that are, maybe in the Middle East or other countries that are being, lashed out, Christians and non-Christians, Christians and even Muslims from the terrorist cells. But, if there's a way to protect them without bringing them in, that would be great. I'm all for helping people. But right now, our system is broken. I feel like we need to stop everyone from coming in until we get a better system in place, whether that takes, a few months or whatever. I just feel like that if safety is the president's main concern for the United States of America, which it should be, then he needs to stop everybody until we get something in place that can, better secure us. And it's a slap to our military who have given their lives to protect us if we just say, come on in, you know. And that's my opinion. Thank you for taking it.
Well, again, it's called Point of View. We give everybody a chance to express their point of view. And if you didn't have a chance to get through, there will be quite an extensive amount of time tomorrow, because I think this will be the major topic. Last week, of course, we spent a fair amount of time talking about the two shooters there in San Bernardino, Saeed Farouk and Tashfeen Malik. But we will certainly be talking about Donald Trump's proposal, but more importantly, getting into, well, if you don't think that's a good proposal or you reject it, apart from just all the name calling, what's your proposal? And we've learned a little bit more about things like the 1952 Inadmissible Aliens Act and what was proposed by Donald Trump. Really what was proposed by Donald Trump has been mimicked by Jimmy Carter as well as by a variety of others, Harry Truman, even some of the things Dwight Eisenhower did in terms of sending a number of Mexicans back. And, of course, you go all the way back to Roosevelt and the Japanese internment, which was a very sorry chapter in American history. So before we go too much further, we might learn from our history and also learn from what are the rules and regulations that we have, and ask ourselves some fundamental questions about what questions we would want to ask if indeed we have a vetting system that was going to be effective. So there are all sorts of issues that we have put on the table today, and we won't resolve all of them, but tomorrow we'll spend some more time talking about that and giving you a chance to join the conversation. Because we have this conversation, I hope that you appreciate what we do, because we are certainly dedicated to giving you as much information as we can. Even today, you can go and find my viewpoint section. You can find the 3 articles I just mentioned a minute ago. We have various videos for you to watch and much more. And so let me encourage you that as you go and get the material that we have, as you listen to the program, that I hope you'll also consider what you might do to support us. We're coming to year end, and this is an opportunity for you to participate. And as I've shared before, only about 1%, really less than 1% of all the people that listen actually give to Point of View. And I recognize that if you're a first-time listener, matter of fact, we had one yesterday, you probably won't give, but just a while back when we did our Truth Team 360, one of the people that was a first-time listener actually gave a gift. So what about those of you that have been listening for years and benefiting from Point of View? I hope that you'll consider what you might do, because we really are dedicated to changing the nation, and you change the nation by individual lives. And if we can change individual lives, we can certainly change the nation. And I did mention that this one thing I have found about our donors, we are all procrastinators. We procrastinate to the very last. And we'd love to hear from you right now. Your gift on December 31st is valuable, but your gift today on the 10th of December would certainly be greatly appreciated. So do what you can to support this ministry, and you can go to the website pointofview.net. Click on that button that says Donate Now, or, of course, if you'd like to send a check, send it to Point of View, Post Office Box 30, Dallas, Texas, 75221. Second hour today, we're going to spend some time talking about how we as Christians can interact with our homosexual friends, neighbors, coworkers. What do we say to them? How do we say it? How can we be a good testimony? We'll talk about that right after these messages.
In 2008, we were told that change had come to America. We got change, all right. What do you think about the changes so far? If you're concerned about the direction of the nation, what are you doing? What are you doing to make a positive change? Point of View Radio has been changing lives for a generation. Listeners have been inspired to apply themselves in all kinds of ways, to stand up as lawyers defending the Constitution and freedom, to start Christian schools, training up a new generation, to launch ministries on college campuses, even to run for and serve in Congress. So again, what are you doing to make a positive change? One way to start today is to join the Truth Team, Truth Team 360. Give in December and each month of 2016 and help us change lives. Call 1-800-347-5151 or give online at pointofview.net or using the Point of View Radio app. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net. Click on Become a Monthly Partner. Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kirby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
This hour we're going to focus on the subject of same-sex attraction and homosexuality, a topic we've addressed many times here on Point of View. But a couple new books out that I think you would like to know about. Preston Sprinkle has written the book, People to be Loved, Why Homosexuality is Not Just an Issue. And then one for young teens, Living in a Gray World, a Christian Teen's Guide to Understanding Homosexuality. Also published one of his pieces that came out recently in his blog, Evangelicals and Homosexuality, which is kind of a uncovering of some of the content in those two books and giving you a little bit of an overview. If you're not familiar with him, Dr. Preston Sprinkle is the vice president of Eternity Bible College's Boise campus. In the past, he has taught at other universities like Cedarville University as well as Nottingham University. He has his PhD from the University of Aberdeen. Author of a number of books, Fight, A Christian Case for Nonviolence, Charis, the God's Scandalous Grace for Us, as well as perhaps the best known, the New York Times best-selling book that he co-authored with Francis Chan, Erasing Hell, What God Said About Eternity. And Preston, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thanks for having me on. I'm happy to be here.
Let's talk about your journey. You talk about that early on in your book, and it seems to me that we're all sometimes on a journey, but especially to try to think about this issue of homosexuality.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and that's I do kind of frame the book in its kind of journey motif, because as Christians, I think a lot of times we believe certain things because it's what we've always believed. We inherited it from our church, our parents, our denomination or whatever. And when it comes to homosexuality, I was a little bit convicted that I had really, really firm beliefs about it, and yet didn't know I couldn't defend my views from the Bible. It's just kind of, I assumed certain things about it. So a few years ago, I began researching pretty heavily, and I began befriending many gay, lesbian, transgender people, and just said, I really want to figure this out and go where the text leads. And that kind of sets the stage for the book. We can probably talk about the content throughout this show, but that was kind of the motivation behind starting the book.
Sure, we'll get into the content in a minute, but I thought I might just point out that one of the things I know you do, you did it, of course, when you wrote your book called Fight, is it wasn't just to study it from a distance, but you actually talked to people that had been in the military, had been wounded, and those kinds of things. Same thing here. You said, I can look at the theological issues, and certainly I'm sure you did that at Aberdeen and other places where you have studied, but at the same time, you said, I need to know some of these people and see if even some of the things that, and I hate to use the we, they, but, that's got to come up occasionally, that we, that is the church, say about them, or they say about us, and I'm not going to use that too often, but I mean, obviously, when you're talking about any kind of issue, whether it's Islam, homosexuality, a variety of others, there's us, them, and there's sometimes a lot of misconceptions on both sides, aren't there?
I think there are, and as a theologian, as an academic, it's so easy to let hot button issues just remain issues, I did this with violence. It's one thing for me to sit in my room and study biblical passages about violence, but it's another thing to talk to people who have served in war, who have lost loved ones in war, and people who have been really affected by it. And any time you put flesh on a topic, in my experience, you treat it more humbly. That doesn't mean you change your view or you don't have any convictions, but you definitely treat it with more sympathy, more humility, more grace, and more understanding. And so it's so important, I think, for Christians, because homosexuality is such a volatile topic, that we do get to know gay and lesbian people if we don't already. But most people I talk to have loved ones and family members and friends who are gay, lesbian, transgender. But for those who don't, I think it is important to listen to stories. It doesn't mean you change your view. It just means that you don't see it as just some issue, but people that are really experiencing it.
And that's really the title of your book, People to be Loved. And, of course, also the other book, Living in a Gray World. And, by the way, I might just mention that if you're interested in either of these books, and you might want to get both of them, they're both published by Zondervan. You probably can find them in your local bookstore, but we also have on our website here information about both the books. You can click on that and find some information. We also have a link to PrestonSprinkle.com, his website. So, again, you don't need to know how to spell his name and everything. It's all right there. And, again, it will give you a lot of information about what he is writing about. And we've also posted his blog here, especially this one on evangelicals and homosexuality, which gives you kind of a good overview. And so if this is an issue that you're dealing with, and I suspect that it is, even if you do not have a friend, neighbor, coworker, family member that's a homosexual or has same-sex attractions, you know somebody that does. You may not know so, and that's one of the things we're going to get into in just a minute. I think you're going to find these very helpful. And so I thought for a few minutes we'll look at some of the biblical material, but again, you do a lot more also answering questions. Were people born that way? What about, if a person has same-sex attractions but they're a Christian, and all sorts of other issues. But before we get into the 6 verses, there is, I think, in both your book, People to be Loved, as well as Living in a Gray World, kind of a understanding of what God's intention for marriage is. So let's begin there if we could.
That's right. I think in the discussion, we often race to these 5 or 6 prohibition passages where the Bible, speaks negatively about same-sex relations. But I think we have to back up and look at, a theology of marriage, a theology of sexuality and gender. And you see even as early on as Genesis 2 where God creates Eve. And it's not, some people, they use the phrase, God made Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. And I don't really like that phrase. I think it can be used in a very demeaning way. But in Genesis 2, you do see Eve's femaleness is necessary for her partnership with Adam. And I look at the Hebrew text in Genesis 2 and kind of point out that this is really intentional. This is God's design for marriage. And then you see throughout Scripture where the male-female component in marriage, you see this in Matthew 19, Ephesians 5, and other passages where the sex difference in marriage, the male and female complement is absolutely fundamental to the way God designed marriage itself. And so I think that gives us kind of a running start. You could look at other passages that do talk about prohibiting same-sex relations.
Well, and again, as you point out, we're talking about one flesh, and you can figure out the biology on that. You're talking about a suitable helper, so it seems like there's at least so, and of course, created male and female, reiterated in the book, not only of Genesis, but in Mark and in Luke and in Romans. And, you go through it, and you just mentioned Ephesians. So you can't say, well, that's just, Old Testament, or that's just one illustration. It's pretty much the warp and woof of Scripture throughout Genesis to Revelation, isn't it?
Yeah, it's really important that when Jesus does talk about marriage in Mark 10 and Matthew 19, he doesn't just, talk about marriage. He actually goes back to the created order in Genesis 1 and 2. And this, some people say, the biblical culture was just patriarchal, it was old-fashioned, and these biblical laws in the Old Testament are outdated. But Jesus goes all the way back to the created design in Genesis 2. And so it's not something that's just kind of, that's the way they thought back then, it's not for today. I mean, Jesus makes fundamental categorical statements about sex and gender within marriage in Matthew 19. And if I can go on for a second more, it's interesting when the Pharisees come to Jesus and ask about divorce, Jesus cites the one flesh passage in Genesis 2. Yes. And that's really all he needed to do if all he was referring to was divorce. But he actually goes all the way back to Genesis 1 and cites the passage about, God created the male and female. So he reaches all the way back to the sex difference that God created humanity as kind of a prerequisite for marriage.
Dr. Preston Sprinkle with us as we talk about his book, People to be Loved and Living in a Gray World. We'll do more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
You know, recently on my radio program, I told the story of Charles Napier to illustrate a principle about ethics. Now, many of my guests had never heard the story, and it bears repeating since it has an application to a recent news story. General Charles Napier was the British commander in colonial India. He is perhaps best known for his response to Hindu priests. Turns out that they came to him complaining about the British prohibition against sati. This is the custom of burning a widow alive on the funeral pyre of her husband. Some threw themselves on the burning wood willingly. Many were forced to do so. William Napier was the brother of Charles Napier and recorded his response to these Hindu priests. He said, quote, "This burning of widows is your custom. Prepare your funeral pyre. But my nation also has a custom. When men burn women alive, we hang them and confiscate all their property. My carpenters shall therefore erect giblets on which to hang all concerned when the widow is consumed. Let us all act according to national customs," unquote. You know, Charles Napier didn't play around. He merely said that if you throw a widow on a funeral pyre, we will hang you. Don't tell me your culture permits this. It is wrong. I thought about this the other day when reading about our country's willingness to prosecute a member of Special Forces because he stopped an Afghan commander from sexually abusing a boy who was chained to his bed as a sex slave. Actually, he did more than stop him. He beat the daylights out of him. You know, the U.S. military apparently ordered soldiers to turn a blind eye to this aspect of Afghan culture. Let's be clear. Child sexual abuse is not culture. What the military needs these days is another Charles Napier who's willing to end this Afghan custom. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kirby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Coach Preston Sprinkle with us today as we talk about his books, People to be Loved, as well as Living in a Gray World. And we have information about both. You can also look for them in your local bookstore. Well, let's get to those clobber verses, that you call them. Of course, we're not going to clobber. We would encourage you to find out more. How about the Old Testament? We have Genesis 19 and Leviticus 18 and 20. How do we think through the Old Testament passages? I think your argument is that Genesis 19 probably doesn't contribute too much to this discussion. And then Leviticus 18 and 20, we can talk about some of the prohibitions and whether they apply today. But how do we think through some of the passages there in the Old Testament?
So Genesis 19 is the famous story of Sodom and Gomorrah, where you have some men who we later learned are actually angels. They come and visit Lot, and some of the men of Sodom come pounding on the door because they want to have sexual relations with these two men whom they thought were men. Now, that passage is where we get the term sodomite, which even today people use it to refer to gay people. I do think that is a bad application of the verse. I mean, yes, there were men trying to have sexual relations with other men, but it was attempted gang rape. And in that culture, it's what's often called what we refer to today as like prison rape, where a man is not gay; he's just trying to overpower somebody else by having sexual relations with them. And I know a lot of gay and lesbian people. Not a single one is advocating for gang rape. So I don't think that Genesis 19 says a whole lot about whether or not consensual monogamous sexual relations can be sanctifiable within God's will. Now, when we come to Leviticus 18 and 20, I do think these passages are applicable because in these two texts we have direct commands. They're not just stories, but they're direct commands given to God's people that a man shall not lie with another man as he does with a woman. And these commands are categorical. They're not limited to like a man having sexual relations with a boy or a master and slave. It is simply a man should not lie with another man. And so when you get to the New Testament, you see the Apostle Paul even kind of alluding back to these verses in the Old Testament. So they do seem to be relevant for Christians.
Let's talk about the issue that surfaces so often, and we've talked about this on the program, and that is, well, you Christians are taking passages from the Old Testament, but you're picking and choosing, because after all, in those same sections there, it says that you're not supposed to eat shellfish, and I've seen you at Joe's Crab Shack and Red Lobster. It says you're not supposed to have clothes of mixed threads, and I can look at you right now and see you're violating that. So you're just picking and choosing those, and besides, those are the Old Testament. None of that applies to the New Testament. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, I see that critique sometimes. It's actually, I think even people who are on the other side of this debate are not using that as much because they're realizing it's not really a good argument. You can't just point to passages that we don't obey and therefore just conclude based on that observation that therefore we shouldn't obey these verses. The difference is in Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20, these prohibitions against same-sex relations are in the context of a whole body of laws against sexual immorality. And all of these laws we obey today. Now, yes, we don't obey the catfish laws, the dietary laws, but the reason why we don't is because the New Testament clearly says that the dietary laws are not applicable to New Covenant Christians. And so we have biblical reasons for saying that these laws are done away with. But when it comes to same-sex relations, the New Testament affirms exactly what Leviticus 18 and 20 affirms. In fact, not to get too technical, but in 1 Corinthians 6, verse 9, Paul he actually invents, as far as we can tell, a Greek word that's never been used before. It's called arsenokoites. Mm-hmm. And this word is actually built upon two words from Leviticus 18 and 20 that talk about a man having sexual relations with another man. So the Apostle Paul, I don't even think we have to assume whether or not he would have agreed with Leviticus. He actually seems to extend that prohibition on into the New Testament. So, yeah, I really think it is true that there's some laws we don't obey, but we can't put these laws against same-sex relations in that same category.
In my book, A Biblical Point of View on Homosexuality, I quote back from one of my previous books on a Christian view of ethics, and I talk about the fact that really when we talk about Old Testament, New Testament, there's discontinuity and continuity, and there's obviously a discontinuity between the ceremonial law in the Old Testament and the New Testament. We don't have temple sacrifices today. There's a discontinuity in terms of the civil law, some of the penalties for sexual immorality, which we don't have. But there's a continuity in terms of various moral issues. And again, the few times I've seen this argument, sometimes you can come back and say, well, then using your logic, chapter 18 and chapter 20 also talk about bestiality. You have no problem with that. And it also talks about incest. You don't have any problem with that. And you start realizing, okay, that's like I said, an argument you don't see so much in scholarly journals. But I can point you to all sorts of blogs and Facebook pages, Preston, where I've seen that show up. So I just like to mention that for our listeners for just a few minutes.
Yeah, I did in my book, actually. I went through and added up all the laws in Leviticus 18, 19, and 20 and looked at all the ones that we obeyed it in and the ones that we don't. I think it was something like more than 20 laws within that section. We clearly obeyed it in. There's only like 4 or 5 that we don't. So even within the narrow context, the argument rests on the other view, I think, to say that we shouldn't obey these laws.
Sure, and you got a list there on page 50, which I would encourage people to look at a little bit more. What about, maybe before we get into the New Testament, you do have a whole section on just the whole issue of homosexuality in Judaism and in the Greco-Roman world. And before we get into the New Testament, talk about that for just a minute, because that's something that might provide a little bit of historical context as well.
This is probably one of the most important sections in the book, because in the debate on same-sex relations, a lot of people are going to the Greco-Roman background to say that consensual, monogamous, same-sex relations didn't exist back then, and therefore, when the Bible is critiquing same-sex relations, it can't be referring to consensual relations. And so this is actually the Eremite doctrine. It was in New Testament and Judaism, and I've done a lot of work in Greco-Roman sources, and I've seen a lot of people absolutely manipulate the background to make the Bible say something that it absolutely doesn't. And that's where I think that section is really important, because the discussion in the Greco-Roman sources is often limited to, scholarly world and journal articles that you can hardly understand. And so I'm trying to bring that down to a really on the ground level in a conversational tone where people can actually look at the background and see that when Paul does talk about same-sex relations in Romans 1, he does speak categorically to all types of relations.
Yes, well, that explains why there's some things in here that were pretty new and novel to me, and I guess I need to read your thesis now, because you actually brought a lot to the conversation that I haven't seen in some of these discussions.
Okay.
So, but again, it's helpful to understand that, and is it fair to say, and I know this is painting with a real broad brush, but is it fair to say that even though in some cases you can find in Greece and Rome where homosexuality was tolerated, it certainly was not ratified, normalized, even codified the way we seem to be heading, not only in Europe but here in the United States?
There's always outspoken voices. You see in Stoic philosophers around the first century and other moral philosophers, they stood against same-sex relations categorically, and more importantly, the Jewish background. And this is something I don't see a lot of people talking about. I mean, Judaism, you can't find a hint of any sort of endorsement with same-sex relations in Judaism. And here's the thing: Judaism, they debated everything. They disagreed. Within Judaism, there was all kinds of debates about everything. Right. But when it came to same-sex relations, it was unanimous. And so, once we understand that Christianity grew out of Judaism and pretty much maintained a Jewish sexual ethic, and it really doesn't hold any weight to say that Paul or Jesus, would have endorsed them.
Again, talking with Dr. Preston Sprinkle. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk a little bit about some of the New Testament verses, Romans 1 and 1 Corinthians 6, and maybe get into 1 Timothy 1, but also get into some of the other practical applications, and that is certainly another very important aspect of the book. For pastors and for those of you that are in leadership, you can certainly benefit from the book, People to be Loved. If you have young people in your sphere of influence, they might be your children or grandchildren, or they might be individuals in a Sunday school class, the other book, Living in a Gray World, A Christian Teen's Guide to Understanding Homosexuality, also a resource that I would mention. And you can find that on our website, pointofview.net, as well as a link to Preston Sprinkle's website and, of course, one of his blog posts on evangelicals and homosexuality. As I send you there, let me also encourage you to consider what you might do between now and year's end. If you have appreciated the kind of conversation that we have each day right here on Point of View, we certainly would encourage your financial support. You can do that by visiting the website, pointofview.net, and clicking that button that says Donate Now. Or, of course, you can write to us, and that is Post Office Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. We believe in changing lives and ultimately changing a nation. And so, again, we know the gospel can do that, but also a Christian worldview is key, and that's what we're talking about here today on Point of View. We'll be back with more right after this.
This time of year, it seems everyone's looking for a better, more affordable healthcare solution. But with costs rising and options limited, where do you turn? If you're a Christian, you turn to Medishare. It's not insurance. It's over 154,000 believers who share each other's medical bills. It's about half the cost of healthcare insurance programs. And it's fully acceptable under the law. Best of all, Medishare is based on the timeless principles found in God's Word. You never pay for things that go against your beliefs. Medishare is healthcare that fits your family and your faith.
Learn how thousands of Christians can help you save on your healthcare. For your free information guide, call 844-45-BIBLE. Not available in Montana. Medishare, affordable biblical healthcare. Call 844-45-BIBLE. That's 844-45-BIBLE.
A big thank you to members of Truth Team 360. You make this program possible. Not a member yet? Join today at pointofview.net. Click on Donate Now and become a monthly partner. Pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Dr. Preston Sprinkle as we talk about his books, People to be Loved, Why Homosexuality is Not Just an Issue, and of course this one that I think would be wonderful to give to young people living in a gray world, a Christian teen's guide to understanding homosexuality. And so these are two different books published by Zondervan, and you can find out more by going to our website, pointofview.net. Well, Preston, I guess I waited too long. We already had a caller say, are you going to get to Romans 1? I said, okay, let's get to Romans 1. And the issue of homosexual and heterosexual sins in Romans 1. How do we think through that particular passage?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned heterosexual sins. I do think when we talk about homosexuality and people say Romans 1, we need to make sure we understand that, I mean, we're all condemned in Romans 1. You read the whole chapter. I mean, there are dozens of sins that are listed, and so we come at this passage broken, or as one preacher said, as a beggar showing other beggars where to find bread. And so, with that sort of posture, when you get to verses 26 and 27, these two verses represent the most descriptive verses on homosexuality, and so this passage is really important. So going back to what we were talking about before, some people are saying that, Paul's writing in the first century Roman world, and in the first century Roman world, the idea of consensual same-sex relations didn't exist. They say, the only type of relationships, homosexual relationships that Paul was aware of were a man having sexual relations with a boy, a master and a slave, or prostitution, and therefore they say, that Romans 1 doesn't apply to consensual monogamous relations today, and that's the argument. And if our listeners haven't heard that, you really do need to pay attention to that, because you're gonna hear it if you haven't. And it's something I do think it deserves a counter argument, and that's what I do. I spend a whole chapter on Romans 1 in my book. And what's interesting is Paul, when he describes same-sex relations here, he doesn't use the many Greek words that referred to a man having sexual relations with a boy. He doesn't refer to prostitution. I mean, everything in his language would seem to include consensual relations, adult consenting relations. So it's really important to pay attention to what Paul's actually saying here. He's not speaking about some specific type of relationship. He is speaking, again, categorically of men having sexual relations with men and women with women.
And again, I was just recently teaching this in a Bible college or Bible school, I should say, in Oregon, not too far from where you are there in Idaho. And one of the arguments was, well, that's just, kind of Paul's idea, or maybe he's just talking about the culture. And in the book, you talk about, too, that this is against nature. In other words, it's tied back to the creation order. Just as when Jesus is asked a question in certainly in Matthew 19, he takes you back to Genesis 1 and 2. Right. So also here, Paul's taking you back to the created order. So he's obviously making an appeal to something more than something that is happening within the culture, a sinful act that is happening within a culture that is being condoned.
Exactly. And if you look at, I explain this in the book, that throughout Romans 1, you see many kind of these allusions or references back to Genesis 1 and 2. He refers to God as the creator. He even quotes Genesis 1 in, I think it's verse 23. And of course, as you mentioned that this is contrary to nature. This is against the created design. And there's something interesting in the flow of Paul's argument here, something that I haven't seen a lot of people point out, or if they have, it's kind of buried in scholarly journals. But Paul, he talks about these three movements of exchange. The created beings exchanged God for creation. In other words, they exchanged the other. God is other than us, and instead of worshiping the other, we wanted to worship the same. We worship creation, and that sort of exchanging the other for something that's the same flows right into the verses about same-sex relations, where women exchanged the other, the man, for something the same for females, and men did the same thing. And so Paul, again, is talking about things that are very just fundamental to the way that our Creator